Hey, welcome everybody to the first in a series of 3 webinars that Community Land Scotland are running over the next few weeks, focusing on the future sustainability of North Highland communities. And as hopefully you can see on the screen, this is the first of the webinars focusing on depopulation. We've had a huge number of people registering for the event, over 140 by this afternoon. I think that's a measure of the interest in this particular topic and what's happening in the north of Scotland. You'll see our Twitter handle is Far North, which will be offensive to people in Shetland and Orkney, but I come from Argyll, so it's the Far North to me. Welcome to everybody. We're running this as a webinar, so apart from the panelists and the presenters, everybody will be muted, but please do use the chat box for general comments, and in particular please use the Q&A function if you've got any specific questions that you'd like to put to the panelists. We've already received some really interesting questions, so it'll be a mix of ones that we've had in advance of the webinar and also questions that come through tonight. We have got these 2 further events planned, so if we don't manage to pick up everything tonight, we can either respond directly to people asking questions after the event, or we can pick them up in future events. So I'm really pleased to welcome tonight a fascinating group of speakers and panellists who are going to give us a broad insight into some of the issues facing Caithness and Sutherland, and how communities in Caithness and Sutherland and other areas of Scotland are working together to address some of these issues. So the speakers we've got for you are Ian Sinclair, who is the Area Manager for Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Hugh Ross, who's the Development Manager for the Staffing Community Trust. I think the busiest man on Skye. He's been involved in a huge number of projects, and most recently working with the Community Housing Trust on a housing project. Ronnie McRae, the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Housing Trust, who's worked with communities across Scotland to deliver housing to address the critical issues of depopulation. Al Whitworth, who is a crofter who's recently moved to the area. It's got some really interesting insights as to the drivers for moving to a region like Caithness and Sutherland, and what else could be done to support crofting. And then Peter Fachenda, last but not least, who is the Programme Manager for the Caithness and North Sutherland Regeneration Partnership. We'll then be moving on to a panel discussion chaired by Magnus Davidson, who I was really pleased to welcome as a new director to Community Land Scotland recently. He's got a real understanding of the issues within the Caithness and Sutherland region, and is involved in numerous local organisations, as well as being a board member of the Thurso Development Trust. Joining us on the panel for the discussion will be Ian, Ronnie and Peter, and I'm delighted to also welcome to the panel Rhoda Grant, MSP for the region, and Community Land Scotland's Policy Director, Dr. Callum MacLeod. So do send in questions via the chat box, via the Q&A function. Amy will tell me off of that, via the Q&A function. And as I say, those that we don't get round to tonight, we'll try and answer directly. We've got a huge amount to get through, lots of big issues to discuss. So a plea again to the speakers to stick to time, and I'll try to do the same now with my short presentation. Before all the speakers, I'm just going to give you a few facts and figures to open the debate tonight. So, in Scotland, 80% of the people live on 6% of the land, and it's the least densely populated country in Europe, with the exception of the Arctic archipelago, which is where probably some of us think we've been living with the cold weather recently. 12 people per square kilometre compared to 25 people per square kilometre in the Andes and 87 people per square kilometre in the Himalayas. So very underpopulated. In a 2018 EU report, a league table of over 2,200 administrative districts ranked according to population density, 3 of the bottom 10 of that 2,200 were in the Scottish Highlands. So we have a very, very low population density. The Highlands and Islands population growth rate between 2011 and 18 was only 0.5%, which is a fifth of the national growth rate. Now, recognising obviously within those figures there are local differences, so some areas in the Highlands and Islands, such as around Inverness, will have grown substantially, but other areas, and I think Caithness and Sutherland is particularly highlighted by a loss of population, and even more importantly a forecast loss of population over the next 30 years. A HIE report in 2019 described the region as characterised by population sparsity, an ageing population and net out-migration of younger people. And yet we all know lots of our younger people want to stay, lots of them want to return to bring up their families, and many, many new people want to come. Recent marketing surveys for community-led housing were hugely oversubscribed, with demand for community houses, and Ronnie will perhaps touch on this later, by a factor of 10 or more. So who owns our land? 700 private landowners own just over half the total landmass of the country. 0.008%, an almost imaginary low number of the Scottish population, own over half of Scotland's privately owned rural land. And really interesting, over 750,000 acres, three quarters of a million acres of Scotland is owned by companies registered in offshore tax havens. And I think most people on the call, and probably most of the speakers, will be well aware that we're a long way from achieving the transparency and land ownership that we would like to see in Scotland. There have been two sort of main subsets of new entrants to the land market in recent years. The super rich, who see ownership of a sporting estate on a par with owning a private jet or luxury yacht, and these users monopolise vast expanses of land. They're often linked to demands for privacy and security, and a really interesting example is an estate in the Cairngorms in 2017, 8,500 acres, was purchased by a Russian vodka oligarch for £25 million. That's the market that the Scottish Landed Estate is operating in at the moment. And those are just the ones we know about. Obviously, a huge number of estate transfers and land transfers are off market. There's also a new entrant to the market fairly recently, which had been entitled in the press the New Green Lairds. In 2020, Savills, the international estate agents, reported a 98% increase in the number of people expressing interest in rural land in Scotland, and pointed to £5 billion of global wealth, so not just European or national wealth, global wealth, chasing estates focused on natural capital and forestry, eager both for government subsidies for tree planting and peatland restoration, as well as the income forecast from carbon offsetting from businesses looking to meet their net zero obligations. So this is a really worrying time for land ownership, and particularly looking to diversify land ownership across a larger number of individuals and communities. And the question that we're asking is this part of a continuing arc of ownership of our rural land, from sporting estates to estates dominated by wind turbines and forestry, and now it's estates dominated by investors looking for income from the net zero economy. So in Caithness and Sutherland, these issues are further exacerbated by the local dominance of land ownership by a very small group of individuals pursuing their own agendas, both on their own land and on neighbouring land. And we've seen examples where that's placing a huge block on the development of the region, often without any public consultation or involvement in their own land use decisions. So I think some of the questions we want to be thinking about tonight, is this what we want Scotland to look like? Is this what will enable our young people to come and live in our rural areas? And is this a just transition to net zero? So what can be done? The Scottish Government recently commissioned the Scottish Rural College to look at attitudes to land reform, to see how the public think about land reform. It was really interesting that almost 3/4 of the people they surveyed supported widening ownership of urban and rural land. Now, we're Community Land Scotland, we obviously support community ownership, but we actually more broadly support a wider diversity of ownership. So more smaller private owners, as well as community owners. And again, it was interesting that only 7% were opposed to that concept of widening ownership. The survey also revealed that use of land for climate change and inequality of ownership were two of the biggest problems facing Scotland's land today. So, Community Land Scotland, in advance of the May 2021 elections that we've just had, we undertook a review of the evidence and are widely consulted to produce our own manifesto on Scotland's land, and you'll find that on our website shown here. A particular interest to us was a Scottish Land Commission report from 2019, which looked at the impact of monopoly ownership and in particular how that impacted on the public interest. And that report was really interesting in that it documented evidence of fear of repercussions for, and their quote, going against the landowner. They also quoted that such fear is a clear impediment to innovation and sustainable development and has no place in a progressive and inclusive Scotland. So that sort of really developed our thinking around some of the asks to include in our manifesto, and there were quite a number, but these are the key ones here around public interest tests for new and existing holdings, controls on total ownership by individuals or companies, an escalating LBTT, stamp duty and old money charge on large estate transactions, retention and increase of the Scottish Land Fund, which is the principal source of funding for communities to acquire land and assets, to £20 million a year, a review of the community rights to buy that are in current legislation to make them more accessible and usable, and a new compulsory community right to buy to further climate change adaptation and mitigation, specifically to enable communities to get much more involved in this sector. We also looked at the impact of holiday homes and second homes in fragile areas and pushed for action to reduce that impact, that negative impact. And finally, a review on how land is valued. So there's a huge number of requests that are in our manifesto, and I think we were all really pleased that the SNP, the Green Party and Labour Party supported the vast majority of the proposals in the manifesto across their own manifestos. So we're really looking forward to the new Parliament and the potential for a new Land Reform Act to perhaps pick up on some of these issues. So anyway, enough from me. I hope that's given a broad introduction to some of the issues where land ownership and depopulation cross, and I look forward to hearing further from our speakers and their thoughts on this issue. So I'm going to pass over to Ian Sinclair, who's the area manager from HIE, to talk about the work that HIE are doing in the region. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to give Ian a go. Okay, thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Ailsa, and evening, everybody. I am hopefully going to deliver you a presentation with the aid of Amy, who's going to be moving the slides for me, as I don't have access to Zoom on my device. So here we go. Great. Thanks, Amy. Could you go to the next slide? So, as Ailsa said, I'm Ian Sinclair. I'm the area manager for Caithness and Sutherland for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Most of you will probably be aware of HIE, but if you're not, we are 30 years old last month, came into being in 1991 as the successor to the Highlands and Islands Development Board, which was the original Economic and Community Development Agency for the Highlands and Islands, which at the time was groundbreaking. And in many ways, we are still groundbreaking because we have that dual function. So what we do, and we are a 300-person strong organisation. We are currently all working from home, which is where I am just now, from Shetland to Argyll. And in Caithness and Sutherland, our two main offices, when we will return to them, are in Golspie and Thurso. But we have staff based across both Sutherland and Caithness. So what I want to do tonight, and I want to be as brief as possible because you've got a really good lineup of speakers here, is to give you a summary of where I think we are at the moment in terms of the challenges and also the opportunities we face. And at the end, I'll give you a look at what I think we might be focused on going forward. Next slide, Amy. So challenges, Ailsa has outlined some of them very well already. We can't ignore the effect that COVID has had on us. Really, for the last 12, 14 months, our agency has been focused on delivering COVID response. But actually, what that's highlighted, apart from the very negative and obvious harm that COVID has caused to our communities, it's also highlighted the resilience of our communities. So the response across the board, not just in Caithness and Sutherland, but certainly as we experienced it on the ground in Caithness and Sutherland, has been nothing short of astonishing. And actually, the other thing it's highlighted is all those issues that we already knew about, whether that's about access to services, or whether it's about housing or fuel poverty, or the digital divide, which I think, you know, we probably have come to grips with more so in the last 12 months than in the last 12 years. It became obvious where people were able to digitally access services and where they were not. So that's a real issue that's come to the surface, and we need to address as a matter of urgency. That whole prism of depopulation, I think, not quite uniquely, but certainly in Caithness and Sutherland, we look at in terms of both demographic, but also economic change. So I'm going to briefly mention some of the economic change part, but I will probably leave most of that to Peter, who will talk to you later on about some responses that we've seen in the north to economic change. Sorry, next slide again. Thank you. Brexit is the other issue that we've been faced with over the last 12 months, but particularly over the last 4 months since the UK exited the European Union. And I would love to say that it's given us a lot of opportunities, and it may well yet do that. But at the moment, we are still facing the challenges that it poses. So whilst we have been working on the premise that tourism, and particularly sustainable tourism, is a huge opportunity for the North Highlands, and you can just see the success of the North Coast 500 brand as how that could take off. We can't ignore the fact that a lot of our skilled labour in the tourism industry has come from outside the UK, and we're already seeing this summer or this spring the effects that is having as tourism businesses reopen, where access to staff is becoming a critical issue, not just here, but Caithness and Sutherland is probably one of the most affected areas, both by staffing reductions and also some of the supply chain issues that we are seeing both in tourism and in food and drink, where access to export markets has become a challenge, and also some of the trade agreements that we're seeing might yet pose us some problems for our indigenous supply chain. So on the one hand, we're seeing opportunities in tourism, and we're seeing opportunities in food and drink, particularly as we go into recovery mode, where local provenance, both in food and drink and in tourism, is a huge bonus for the Highlands and Islands. But we also see particular opportunities in renewable energy. And I suppose with renewable energy, as it is with tourism, food and drink, it's about our geographic proximity to the assets that we have. In energy, it's about our proximity to offshore wind resource. The wind resource is fantastic in the North Highlands. It's also about our access to wave and tidal resource. We have the strongest tidal currents in Europe, if not in the world. We are rapidly catching up in terms of hydrogen, and in terms of energy storage. We have some remarkable battery storage technology in the North Highlands. And also, well, not so much carbon capture yet, but certainly carbon sink is a huge opportunity, because we have the peatlands on our doorstep. And we have, whilst we have over the last 15, 20 years made great strides in peatland restoration, there's a huge amount can be done yet. So huge issue, sorry, huge opportunity. Next slide again. please, Ailsa. Sorry, Amy. Final slide from me. We have, as we go into the next Parliament and we have a new government, we have a recovery plan, which I think is coming together certainly in a Highlands and Islands basis, but in our neck of the woods in Caithness and Sutherland, which is about turning resilience into recovery. So that network of largely community-led resilience, which was so successful over the last 12 months, we now want to help into recovery. So we have a fantastic network of community anchor organisations and local development trusts that have been doing a fantastic job. It's how we now help them to engage in the recovery process and to turn that into the kinds of activities, whether they are economic or not, that sustain local populations. And one of the really exciting things for me over the last 6 months has been to watch the growth of the community wealth building agenda, and also what we're currently calling repopulation zones, which began in earnest about 6 or 7 months ago at the convention of the Highlands and Islands, although it's been on obviously a lot of people's agendas for a lot of years. So since October last year, we've been involved in a working group with Scottish Government and also local authorities in the Western Isles, Argyll and Bute, and North Ayrshire, along with Highland Council, on the issue of depopulation, but also repopulation. So we now have certainly a written agreement on what we're currently calling repopulation zones. We need to find a better term than that because it smacks of planning, and it needs to be deeper than that. But there are now papers on that, which they're not quite on the web yet, but I will give you a link to that as soon as we get it, which will be in a matter of a couple of weeks. And that really instills the concept of a repopulation area or a repopulation zone that brings together all the agencies, including government, to look at how widely and how deeply they can engage in places like Caithness and Sutherland. And the main geographic focus for this agenda is in those local authority areas that I just spoke about. So in Highland Council area, it's Caithness and Sutherland. And for me, that's a really exciting prospect as we go into the new parliamentary term. Without extending it too long, those are the kind of recovery actions that you've got in front of you there that we're planning to take forward over the next year to 18 months. The uppermost in my mind, as I say, is that idea of a repopulation zone and how we can make that work on the ground. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm conscious I want to give people a chance to not just present, but also ask questions. So thank you.
That's great, Ian. Thank you so much for that. And it's really heartening to hear about the in-depth work on these repopulation zones. We really look forward to seeing how they're developing. Really clear that all of those actions depend on people, and you need more people. So I'm going to pass over now to Ronnie McRae, the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Housing Trust, who will tell you how he's, just with his own force of personality, attracting more people to the region as well as all his developments. Over to you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Ailsa. Just trying to get my screen to share here. I don't know, has anyone seen that yet?
Not yet. That's it.
Hopefully that's it working now. Just for those that don't know about us, we operate as a social enterprise. Our role is really to assist communities get access to affordable housing, primarily, but also associated elements that can maybe help them ensure their long-term sustainability. We think it's an exciting sector at the moment, and there's lots of opportunities. Hopefully you'll see some moving through. I'm just showing you an interactive map of some of the projects we're working on, and between us and our friends at south of Scotland Community Housing, we cover basically the whole of Scotland. We cover Glasgow, Edinburgh and everywhere north, but our bulk of our work has been in the north. Our work is always with communities, and repopulation and regeneration is the main focus of virtually every community we work in now. Housing's got a hugely important role to play in that. And we've been extremely lucky over the last few years. Scottish Government and the main statutory bodies have been recognising that and assisted by putting in a number of mechanisms that are enabling it. When we're working with communities, we strongly encourage a holistic approach. So it's not just looking at housing, it's looking at the economy and jobs, it's looking at social infrastructure, and there can be many other drivers for housing needs, and also target groups, whether it's young, elderly, businesses. So we generally ask communities why are they looking at housing, and why do they want to repopulate and regenerate. We ask them to think about housing strategies, and we give them lots of examples and try and work through housing strategies with them, and then put a business plan in place for moving projects forward. You'll see some examples on the slides there of the different elements that can work alongside housing. So, you know, in Balmacara, the shinty pitch was a driver, and there's housing built beside the shinty pitch, but one worked alongside the other. The Gairloch project, the community-owned tourist information centre there, worked alongside a lot of other housing options, as well as commercial activity, and MOD built a purpose-built air training facility in Strontian. Alongside many other projects that they're running in Strontian, the community built and own the new primary school. And in Shieldig, you know, there was lots of different housing opportunities provided. Having said that, we encourage communities not to look at housing. I better focus on housing for a wee minute. Our primary role is to develop solutions, and we do that through a range of, we've over the last few years, we've developed a range of housing tenures and finance models which have been supported by Scottish Government and local authorities. So things like the Rural Housing Burden, the Rent to Buy scheme, self-build loan fund, long lease schemes. We're working with a partnership on forest crofts, and a wide range of other work that we feel is required to provide a mix of tenures. We feel especially smaller communities need a wide range of options for various reasons. One is to make sure that the local residents or folks wanting to return or to attract new folks, you need to provide what they might need, and it might not always be social rent. It could be low cost home ownership. It might be self-build. It could be a range of options. And also because not all the options work in every community. So, you know, it strengthens the communities. It also reduces risk, and it can help provide a bit of scale, which makes projects more achievable. And the same principle applies to mixed providers. So you'll see some examples. Hugh will talk about the staffing project and the mixed providers there. The community are owning houses, the housing association are, and we're providing to as well. So you've got a mix of providers, which again shares risk and provides a bit of scale to help make the projects stack up, which is hugely important. I think the best examples of projects, and Hughes is certainly one of them, all have a mix of housing tenures, and they've got a mix of uses. In Hugh's case, it's a health centre and some commercial elements as well. So hugely positive projects moving across Scotland at the moment. Obviously, funding's a hot topic for all communities, and there's, thanks to various statutory bodies and funders, there is a range of options just now. Like I said earlier, Scottish Government have long since recognised the need for rural development, and especially housing, the important role that plays in it. So things like the Scottish Land Fund, which has been extended, again, fantastic news for areas such as Caithness and Sutherland. The Rural and Island Housing Fund, again, that's been extended. It's been hugely popular, and what that's done has been, it's been able to provide confidence to communities. The Scottish Government have gone away from the one-off challenge funds, which really didn't give the communities time to build a project. It takes a long time to build a project and work through it. The Rural Housing Fund is there, and we envisage, or we hope, that it's going to be there for a long time to come and become mainstream, because the amount of confidence that it's created in communities is huge, and it can't be understated. We've got the Self-Build Loan Fund. Self-Build has been a massive provider of housing in the rural areas for many years, but it took a hard hit when the financial crash happened. So Scottish Government have provided a self-build loan fund. It's like a lender of last resort, and that's proving hugely effective, and it's just getting extended as we speak by Scottish Government. Also initiatives like the community asset transfer, and there's some examples on the screen there of community asset transfers, both in Applecross and in Appletibouy, but there's many more. That's a very useful process for communities. There's also a wide range of grant funders. Housing generally can struggle to get external grant funding, because a lot of them see it as a statutory role. But there are a number that will do it. Organisations like Nationwide, Quaker, and of course there's wind farms that can assist. And there's also private finance that can be accessed from, especially from ethical, the more ethical banks, like of your Triodos and Ecology and ones like that. That's if you require require grants. We have worked out a few models, both round about self-build. The rent-to-buy model was based on loan only, and there's also examples on our website of the Rothy Marcus project, which again was pretty much self-funding. As Ian alluded to there, things like Brexit and COVID have changed the landscape in construction and made it more challenging, to say the least. But so maybe not all that will be self-funding as it was, but certainly positive models there. Sorry, I'm skipping there. You'll find more details on our website, but I mean, Gairloch is a template that we use widely, and it's on a similar vein to staffing. Lots of different uses, lots of different tenures. There's a housing association built 14 houses, the council built 8, we built 5, and I think there's something like 6 different housing tenures on that project. The community decided what went where. We were the vehicle that was used to acquire all the land, but then the community divided up. So there's a commercial shop, there's a community-owned tourist information with a range of different uses in it, and it sells produce from something like 25 different local producers, which is a fantastic resource to have in the community. And also the Air Training Corps, the MOD built a purpose-built Air Training Corps there. Like I said, different drivers. The school in Strontian has been a great success, and that was alongside housing as well, which delivered quite a number of housing, and that's still growing. The community are going on with other projects and more housing requirements. So that was fantastic to see. And I'll not say too much about staffing because Hugh's going to take that away just now. So I think hopefully that gives you a little flavour of the principles we use when we're looking at housing, but we're keen to speak to any communities out there and see how we can help support you. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ronnie. Yeah, some really interesting points there about how the Housing Trust take that holistic whole community approach to development, which has been so successful in many Highland communities, and that the Housing Trust bring a real focus on the practical and the deliverable. So having dealt with the Housing Trust personally on projects, you know, they are excellent in working with the community to determine what is right for that community and what is deliverable in that community. So hopefully everyone's keeping an eye on the chat box. There's some really interesting information in there about funders and some of the developments. So do keep an eye on that. Kirsten, I've noticed you put a question in the Q&A which Ian wants to answer about repopulation zones. So I'll ask Magnus if he can pick that up at the start of the panel discussion, if that's okay. So just conscious of the time, I'm going to move on now to Hugh at staffing. You've had a bit of a brief introduction there to the work that Hugh's been doing, but this is a really exciting scheme, and we picked it tonight because of its potential resonance for a lot of communities and addressing a lot of the communities that you have in Caithness and Sutherland. So over to you, Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you, Ailsa. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm just going to quickly share the screen here. I'm the development officer for the Staffing Community Trust up in the northeast of Skye. So obviously you're looking at a kind of drone picture there of our development. You're looking towards Staffing Bay there. Beyond there is the Western Isles, if you paddle a wee bit. Our development is obviously just below you there, and it comprises of 6 3-bedroom houses, a new health centre which the NHS Highland will rent on a long-term basis, and 2 commercial units. Our development has taken a long time to get to this stage. We started off back in 2014. Basically, the situation in Staffing, not dissimilar to the rest of the West Coast, an overheated property market where young people and families really struggle to be able to afford to buy in their own community, or even kind of find rented accommodation, because obviously it's a scenic area and demand for properties and holiday homes and second homes is very, very high. The Staffing Community Trust were kind of quite concerned because about half an hour south of Staffing is Portree, Skye's capital, and there was quite extensive housing getting built in Portree over the last decade, about 250 houses, an affordable housing kind of development. That obviously was good news for Portree, not great news for Staffing, and it was sucking away the younger people and families, the very people that we were trying to keep hold of. So the Trust started speaking to the local, Drew Miller was his name, and he mentioned the Highland Small Communities Housing Trust as it was then, and discussed getting an affordable housing survey questionnaire kind of produced. So that was back started 2013 and going into 2014, and essentially spoke to different businesses and residents and asked them to get a picture of what the housing kind of demand and need was in Staffing. And at the time, the authorities, including Highland Council, were saying that was because there was so much housing getting built elsewhere. There was nothing happening in Staffin, so people didn't really see the point in putting their name down for a house in Staffin. There hadn't been any affordable housing built in Staffin since 1999, which is now 21 years, I think. So essentially, you know, a whole generation went by with any kind of housing. So the trust had the report published by the Highland Small Community Housing Trust. We then had a summit of sorts with the council, Lochhouse and Skye, or local housing association, local councillors, and also kind of young people that were struggling to find accommodation. And from that, we had a kind of call. Oops, we had a call for sites, and I'll just go back there. We had a call for sites, and we kind of progressed looking at a number of different sites across Staffin. A lot of these sites were, you know, in by Croftland, good kind of arable ground, which is obviously, as you see from the slide there, quite scarce in Staffin. And then this site here, which is in the Stenchel common grazing, and is very close to Staffin Primary School, Scotch Staffin, that you can see there, just to the right of the screen. The trust looked at this site. The township were willing to sell it. It was on pretty peaty ground, as you can see there, just beside the kind of river there, and we all thought that would make an ideal site. So one of the kind of main kind of challenges to the trust was trying to get this site progressed, because Staffin's in a national scenic area. So this kind of environmental designation was something I never really was very aware of until I started in this job, and I don't think it's something that people in Staffin are really very aware of until they're wanting to build a shed or a byre or a house. So essentially, Scottish Natural Heritage at the time were not very keen on this site, because they said it kind of impacted on the view towards the Trotternouse Ridge, which you see a kind of edge of it there. So that became a political hot potato for about 18 months or so, and we worked hard with also Lochhouse and Skye Housing Association to try and combat, you know, the concerns of SNH. And we had a lot of help from Rota Grant's colleague David Stewart, and from Kate Forbes, and from Dave Thompson, stretching back over a number of years. So we went and pushed for planning, and we kind of finally seemed to win the kind of argument for the need for the development. And the development is 6 3-bedroom houses, 1 health centre, and 2 commercial units. The reason why that's the makeup is 2 of those houses will be owned by the Staffin Community Trust, 2 will be owned by the Communities Housing Trust, and 2 will be owned by Lochhouse and Skye Housing Association. Essentially, it's a way of sharing kind of the risk. So the Staffin Trust had never done any project of this type. Hadn't really been an organisation that looked at purchasing land or assets. It was more there to kind of facilitate kind of economic and social kind of wins for the community. So we kind of joined forces with the 2 organisations. Obviously, Lochhouse and Skye Housing Association are just up the road in Portree, and Communities Housing Trust over in Inverness, but very kind of strong presence on the West Coast. This is a chance to try and lever in other kind of you know, properties and buildings that we kind of need for the community. And our old health centre, well, stroke an old nurse's cottage, was kind of crumbling, and there was a real lack of kind of economic kind of commercial space in Staffin. So we thought we'd try and lever that in, and it would also help us trying to get funding from other organisations such as Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Government, the Land Fund, the Rural Housing Fund, etc. So this is obviously the turf cutting last August, socially distanced, of course, and this is in February of this year. This is the development now taking shape. Sorry. So you can see in the background there, that's obviously quite a scenic kind of picture, but that kind of therein, I suppose, lies the problem. You know, SNH thought that this was going to be too much of an impact on that kind of ridge, we kind of disagreed, and we think that the drone pictures and all images that we've kind of circulated ever since have proven that is, you know, not the case. It's more of a kind of it's added very much to the community. The problems that, you know, the community and staff faces are, as I said, very kind of similar to kind of other areas in the West Coast. In 2014, when we had our housing needs done, the percentage of second homes housing stock was at 18%. Airbnb wasn't something that people really talked about then, and I would expect that figure to be a lot higher now. And also, for example, we've got people with a lot of pods just even in their gardens who are kind of making hay while the sun shines. That's got a huge detrimental impact on our kind of community and trying to reduce the average age of the population. And there's a very kind of strong-willed and capable group of young people in Skye at the moment who have set up a campaign group to kind of highlight these kind of issues and you know, just point out back that when a croft house goes on the market in Stafford, which it did recently, it was going for £250,000. It was just 3 bedrooms, one of those rooms being a box bedroom. The croft came with it. Well, obviously there's a kind of high price tag with that, but good kind of arable ground, and you know, young people just can't kind of cope with that. So this development is going to provide a massive boost to our area. 6 kind of families, children just with a school just 30-second walk along the road. A health centre we want to see kind of operating, you know, every day of the week with NHS Highland. So if we have a podiatrist coming up to the north end of Skye, you know, we're going to have, you know, hope to have every, you know, 6 or 7 people that he might do house visits, have it in that health centre. We want to have near me, we want to have kind of pilots there, we want to have remote consultations, you know, we want to see it used for alcohol support group, midwifery services, baby groups, etc., etc. And the business units, we've had a lot of interest in that as well. We're hoping that's going to protect and also kind of support kind of jobs. So basically, as Ronnie says, it's not just about houses, it's about the whole picture. And you know, we want to see that area becoming, well, it will become a busy kind of bustling kind of hub, and it'll be something that, you know, it'll give a huge boost to our community. I suppose in terms of, I don't know about advice, but for kind of communities in Caithness and Sutherland, we've leaned on the Communities Housing Trust and Lochhaus and Skye very heavily over the last few years. I would kind of not want to blow smoke up Ronnie, but I would say they're one of the most important organisations in the Highlands at the moment, as you can see from the work they've done. You know, it's cut both ways. You know, the Communities Housing Trust have had and then into, you know, the kind of community through our connections with obviously the Crofting Township, etc. It's certainly not been an easy kind of process, but you know, we're seeing it taking shape now, and it's going to be a very rewarding development once it's open. But that's not going to be the end of it. You know, we have to manage the development, you know, make a profit from it, look after it, ensure that it's kind of there for generations, which will be because we've got responsibilities now. So that's something that the board of directors are all kind of looking forward to, and you know, looking to see the trust grow at the same time. So that's kind of going to be, you know, a very kind of exciting kind of time for us. This is just the last slide here, and you can see that house in the middle there. To the left of that house is where the development is now. So you can see, obviously from a land perspective, you can see the arable ground there and over to the townships under below the Kerrang. So Stafford is still a very active crofting community, but you know, when we can make deliver developments on poor PT kind of ground such as that common grazing, then it makes perfect sense. It was a first for our community, you know, the first development on a common grazing, and we hope it's the first of many, and look forward to kind of working with the Communities Housing Trust and Lochhaus and Skye in the future again. So I think that's me just on 12 minutes. Sorry, Ilsa.
No, that's great, Hugh. It's really interesting. And I think just such an inspiring example of the vision and tenacity of a community to keep going in the face often of quite obstructive authorities. And I think there's a lesson there for organisations like Community Land Scotland, and hopefully you realise we do quite a lot of work to try and clear some of those blockages in either planning or infrastructure, or some of the conservation agencies, but there's more to be done, and the more great examples the better. I think also you mentioned a couple of times there about second homes and holiday homes. That's a big issue in a lot of communities. Community Land Scotland are also doing some work at that at the moment, so we'll be sending out details. So
yes, just as a quick aside, Elsa, yes, very much so. During the kind of impasse we had with SNH, Community Land Scotland were very strong with us. David Cameron and the likes of Peter Peacock and Callum obviously now have taken up the cudgels for us on many occasions. So it's been very kind of gratefully received.
Brilliant, thank you, Hugh. Right, okay, I'm going to move over to Al Whitworth now. Al's got a really interesting story to tell. He's relatively new to the region, and hopefully he's going to share with us some of his thoughts on crofting, and in particular what drew him to the region and what lessons there are to be learned for agencies from that. So sorry, Al, you're towards the end now, so I'm going to have to be really strict on time.
Yeah, no problem at all. Hopefully you can see my screen share there. Yeah, thanks very much for asking me to join. I'm really humbled by that. It's really nice. So I want to just give a bit of an... I moved here 3 years ago now to Skerry on the north coast. We moved from Shetland, so we actually come south. Rare people to have moved south to this area. But I just want to give you a bit of an experience, an idea of our experience of moving to the area, why we came, and what I think could be improved for that process. I guess we're relatively young people in the terms of crofting. We're young, we're under 41, so we were 34 when we moved here. So I'm going to focus on the crofting side of things as well, because that's where our interest was. So we were in Shetland, we were looking for land. We had a house in Shetland, but we couldn't get the land around it, and we couldn't really find any crofts available. We were looking right across the whole of the Highlands, really. We weren't that fussed as to where we went. We just wanted some land to live sustainably, to grow food and live a little bit more simply, really, and have part-time jobs and that sort of thing, but live off the croft more. So in terms of Skerry, what brought us here was we eventually, we'd been searching for so long for land and just couldn't find anything affordable. Everything was crazy prices, far out with what we could afford. This land and croft in Skerry came for sale on the open market. It was 150,000. I'm going to share with you the actual cost, because I think that's really relevant to discussions, which is a lot of money for an 8-acre croft and a small house in such a remote place with not really much idea of jobs and things. We were really fortunate in Shetland as the house price had really shot up, so it did mean that we could move here, but we had to borrow some money. And if you're coming to a croft lifestyle and you want to live off the land, if you've got to go and borrow 50, 80, 100 grand as a mortgage, that's really difficult to then live off the land. You're going to go and have to get a full-time job, which is kind of defeats the point of crofting. We were fortunate in that we had, I'm self-employed as a joiner and builder, and my wife is a relief postie and worked in hospitality as well. So we knew our jobs were transferable to pretty much anywhere in the Highlands. So we were very fortunate with that. And we've managed to move here and establish ourselves on the land. But it was very difficult. I mean, North Coast 500 has probably changed it now for us to the point that if we were in the same situation, we couldn't afford to move here now. So yeah, that's a real shame. There's still a beautiful community here. It's a great community spirit. And that's one of the things that drew us to Skerry in particular. But as I say, we were looking all over the place. So I want to talk a little bit about what more could be done, or what we think needs to be done to make it easier for us. So this is just a screenshot from the Scottish Crofting Federation. They send out a monthly list of available crofts, which is actually where we found our croft and house. And if you have a glance down the list, you see there's, sorry, I'll just get rid of these chat boxes, which you might be able to see. I'm just aware of that. The only few down here with houses are at the bottom. They're £300,000 in Caithness, and a few with house sites, very few. The rest of them are just land, and it's a lot of money for a very small couple of acres of land. You've then got are you going to be able to get a building plot on that? Who knows? You know, it's you're buying with good faith of hoping you can. So that's the current situation, and that's that's everything available in Caithness and Sutherland. So, but is there really demand? I mean, I kind of think sometimes we wanted to come and simplify our lives, kind of live off the land, you know, that kind of green thing. But are many other people wanting to do that? Well, I think there are, and we were really interested in the Woodland Croft idea, and I see Jamie's on the conference as well, which is great, from the Woodland Croft Partnership. They have a register of interest for Woodland Crofts, and I think at the moment there's around 250 on that list, and a good percentage, over half, were interested in Sutherland, and over a quarter interested in Caithness as well. So there is the interest up here, and also the Crofting Federation held a couple of open meetings in February about access to crofts. And both those meetings were oversubscribed with people wanting to know how they can get their hands on crofts and things, and what they can do for it. So what do I think could help things a little bit? Well, what came out of those two meetings in February was the Crofting Commission really need to implement their own rules on absentee and disuse of crofts, because there's a lot of crofts lying unused in the Highlands. But as a short term, there's a more positive, less regulatory offer of creating affordable crofts with the potential for self-build housing in either new or existing townships. I think this could be key, and we would have absolutely jumped at this opportunity had we had it long before. It would have made, we could have afforded to buy the croft and have a bit of money behind us to set up our croft business, and we could be producing food for the local community now, rather than being 3 years in and still struggling to get to that point. We're getting there now. So, for example, if a 5-acre croft was available with outline planning permission for about 30,000, young people and couples and things and families could potentially afford that with a loan or having some money behind them, and then look at maybe getting a caravan to live on temporarily until they build their own house, and build their business up slowly and provide food or crafts or lots of things that crofts can provide. And where can these crofts be created? Well, they could be created on community-owned land or working with private estates. I know not always easy with those things, but there are some private estate landlords that might be interested in this. So I think there's potential there. And also common grazing land. That's I guess it depends on how that's used in the areas, but there are far less sheep and cattle now on the common grazing. So is there a potential there for new crofts to be created? So that's all. I just wanted to be very briefly just share our experience. That's really, the prices up here are crazy these days, and it's very difficult, and something needs to be done. And I think that creating this affordable options for people to come in and actually live off the land, produce food, crafts, and live sustainably in the area, it's a bit of a reinvention of crofting. I think it's something that should be really looked at hard, especially for Caithness and Sutherland. So I hope you found that interesting.
That was great, thanks Alan, and it's really good to get those practical on the ground ideas for people that know how to make it work. So thank you for that. Jamie's actually put in the chat box again details of the Woodland Crofts website, so I would really urge you to go and have a look at the work that they're doing if your community is interested in creating woodland crofts. Right, over to Peter. Thank you, Peter. Peter's going to talk a bit about the work of the Caithness and North Sutherland Regeneration Partnership, and then after that we'll go to Magnus for the panel discussion. Thanks, Peter.
Yes, hi, thanks. Just see if I can get it to share what it's supposed to share here. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see that. Is that in full screen now? We should be able to. There we go. I'm hoping that you're seeing a full screen. Is that correct?
Yeah. Peter, yeah.
And is that, you're just seeing a single slide at that? Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Peter Ficenda. I'm the Programme Manager for the Caithness and North Sutherland Regeneration Partnership. I'm just going to whiz through this fairly quickly as I'm conscious of time. So the partnership's been in existence since 2007, and it's a partnership between the Highland Council, Highlands and Isles Enterprise, Caithness Chamber of Commerce, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, Skills Development Scotland, Dounreay Site Restoration Limited, who've just joined as a member on their own right, and the Scottish Government. And the partnership's main aim is to maintain and, if possible, increase the GDP. So that's the gross domestic product. I realise that that's an acronym of the Dounreay Travel to Work area by actively working to promote existing employment, encourage new employment, and promote the area as an attractive location in which to live and work. And we're organised with an executive board that consists of an independent chairman and the chief executives of those bodies that you saw before, largely chief executives or senior staff members of the partners. There's an advisory board that helps to guide the direction of the partnership, and that has a very large group of stakeholders, including local councillors, community councillors, trade unions, MSP, etc. So there's a very wide range of stakeholders involved there. And then there's a delivery group that runs the programme. I chair that, and that works with the area manager of the funding of the partner bodies, looking at funding and also managing the project activities that we're undertaking. The reason we were established is that graph, basically. And I apologise a little bit in that this is slightly out of date, this graph now, and you can, because there's some work going on and looking at the lifetime plan, the actual slope there is likely to change, and it may move a little bit to the right or to the left depending on activity on the site. And I've rebased it. This, as you can see, this was originally looking at a peak in 2018. I've just rebased it to this year. But you can see the basic idea is that between now and the interim end state, so when the site is fully decommissioned, there will be a significant number of job losses in the area. There's about 1,200, there's actually about 1,500 now on the site because of the fact that the site has now been brought back in-house by the NDA, and a lot of people who were subcontracting are now included in the headcount on the site. So you can see that's quite a challenge. And that doesn't include the Vulcan site, which is adjacent and also employs about 200 people and is in the process of decommissioning. So that's the challenge that for the area is that significant loss of well-paid jobs over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, our approach to working on that issue is that we concentrate on opportunities that take advantage of the geographic and historic strengths in the region. We have two strands of activity. We look at major projects that will provide employment directly, and we look at enabling activities that will support economic growth. And we're targeting the creation of, in the region of about 2,000 full-time jobs in the area in the period of the decommissioning programme. Oops, I need to go back there, sorry folks. Excuse me. The project areas that we're focusing on currently are the new energy economy. Ian touched on this earlier. Offshore wind, for example. So if I pick out one example from that, the St. Olaf Pier, which is currently, if anybody's been to Thurso recently or has been by there, they'll see that there's been quite a lot of work on the St. Olaf Pier, where it's being widened and the berth alongside is being deepened. There's about £8 million of public funds have gone in to support that project. 5 million from the NDA and 3 million from HIE. So that's a typical project. Now that will increase the capacity of the port and enable it to widen its potential customer base to attract other work. That's the point. Now, whilst that won't necessarily employ a huge number of people directly at the port, it gives an extra opportunity for other industry, businesses, activities to be attracted to the region. I'm not going to go down this list in step by step, but I'll pick out things as they're going along. For example, recent developments around the hydrogen front, Ian mentioned it. We're doing some work at the moment looking at what the demand for hydrogen in the area is likely to be. We've identified about 4 areas of potential project development that could attract hydrogen-related activities to the area. Our kind of basic premise here is, if we're going to be consuming something like hydrogen locally, we have a huge production of power locally, which for those that understand hydrogen, one of the main ways of producing hydrogen in a green form is through electrolysis. So it needs a huge amount of power and it needs water. Rather than importing that to the region, we're seeking to find ways of having it produced here, and the jobs that go with that being here. It also obviously is a much more sensible approach to produce something close to where you're going to be using it, rather than transporting it all over the place. Okay, so those are sort of typical ideas that we're working on. We've got Spaceport Sutherland vertical launch site, which is in development, which is currently subject to some legal challenge, but that we're hoping will be dealt with over the summer. And that again is the actual jobs at the site will be a small number in comparison to the size of the whole of the economy, but the opportunity to attract other industries to and support services to around that activity are very large. So that's an exciting opportunity. And I'll just touch on one other, which is we submitted in March an application to have the Dounreay decommissioning site considered for the siting of what is called the spheroidal tokamak for energy production fusion reactor, and that's currently being assessed by the UK AEA. So we're waiting to hear what's going to happen on that. And we are looking at all of our project activity in a sustainable manner, and increasingly looking at things like carbon footprinting, etc., to take account of that in our deliberations. And then finally, talk about enabling activities, things like skills, research and technical innovation, connectivity, and general infrastructure. So, for example, Neva Bridge, which I'm delighted to see is the activity on design is now underway. So we're looking forward to that being replaced. And one other thing I'm going to touch on there, which is the Wick Airport public service obligation. So at the moment, if those of you that are aware, there are currently no scheduled flights from Wick, but we have now achieved Scottish Government approval to support a limited restart of flights. We're in the process of developing a specification for that to enable scheduled flights to restart from Wick and hopefully build back up to a service that will support the development in the area. And that's about all I've got to say. Comments and questions I will obviously take as part of the and of the panel, and I'm going to stop sharing now. And hopefully that wasn't more than my time. Thank you for that. It's a bit of a canter, but hopefully I got across what we're trying to talk about.
Absolutely. Right, I'm going to pass over to Magnus now. We're a wee bit over time, so I think we'll beg the indulgence of the panelists and audience to perhaps run over by a few minutes at the end to make sure we get our planned 30 minutes, but I'll leave it to Magnus now, who's currently going to be very firm and focused. Over to you, Magnus. Thank you.
Thanks, Elsa, and thank you to everybody there that gave really interesting presentations, and hopefully gives a bit of an overview of the region, some of the challenges and some of the solutions that we're facing. We are running a little bit over, so I'm going to do two of two things. The first of which is, as Elsa alluded to, ask if the Panel members, don't mind running over by a few minutes, and we'll just keep it to that if that's okay, and I'll thank them for that. But what I'll do is I'll pose my first couple of questions to those that didn't give presentations and are new to the panel, so Callum and Rhoda in particular. I'll just run through some questions and direct them directly to different panel members, and then we'll open up and ask some questions to everybody. So we've had loads and loads of really good questions coming in, and we've certainly kept some of them back for the later events as well, but please do keep them coming in and we'll keep trying to answer them even offline if we need to. I'm going to direct my first question to Callum, who's our Policy Director at Community Land Scotland. And it's a question I guess many people will be asking here in Caithness and Sutherland, and that's about what you feel the role for well-run, and I guess private estates here, that create and support their local communities. And maybe just to go a little bit further off the back of the excellent presentation from Al there, what you feel for the suggestion for New Crofts fits into the private and community-owned estates. Sorry, that's quite a mouthful, and hopefully you've taken it all in.
I have. Thanks very much indeed, Magnus, and thanks to everybody for really fantastic and inspiring presentations as well this evening. I think private landowners, private estates have an important part to play in relation to the sustainability of rural communities in the region. I don't see this as a binary either or discussion or debate, frankly. I think the key issue really is around what communities want, I'm using communities in the broadest geographical sense, want in relation to their sustainability in the economic, environmental and social terms. And we know that there are lots of examples amongst a whole range of different landowners in relation to doing that. They have done that. I think the critical issue though is, and there's no avoiding this as well actually, is in relation to Scotland's pattern of land ownership. There are a couple of things there. First of all, if we're talking about land reform as an overarching theme in all of this, which can be defined really as changes to the ownership and or use of land in the public interest, it's very clear that there's a very distinctive connection between owning the land and what happens on the land. And we've seen that clearly in some of the examples in the presentations. But within that context, the very concentrated pattern of rural land ownership in Scotland can be structurally problematic. And we've seen examples of how it can be problematic from recent research from the Scottish Land Commission published in March 2019 into large scale and concentrated land ownership, where it talks about examples of where communities were having problems in terms of having security of housing or housing developments being blocked, where there were situations as well where people were being felt vulnerable in terms of their employment opportunities or contracts being awarded by dint of the fact that there is large-scale ownership in some contexts and the kind of dynamics that causes. Now that is frankly a very challenging and unprogressive situation to be in 21st century Scotland. So changing that needs to be a fundamental aspect of how we think about whatever that vision is, and having that diversity of land ownership and land use that's sustainable is very much part of that process. And I'm conscious that Rhoda will have something to say, a lot to say, I'm sure, in terms of this as well. But it was very heartening from a Community Land Scotland perspective to think about ways in which the commitment, a cross-party commitment to new land reform legislation that places the public interest very much at the centre of land ownership and how that's going to determine, which I think is by its very definition is significant to all of us. So that's critical, as is in fact the issue around investments as well. And I think part of that question is, if I'm right, is around issues of subsidy and grants. Well, the issue there is these are public investments, and private landowners, large-scale private landowners, are no strangers, frankly, either to grants and subsidies in terms of what they're doing too. The challenge, and the important challenge, is how we actually ensure that public benefits are delivered and community benefits are delivered too, right across the spectrum in terms of these issues, that actually deliver on population for communities themselves. And very briefly, to kind of respond to your second question, which is around crofts and where that sits in terms of private and community ownership with regard to that, I think it sits very comfortably in that. And I think both community and private, and indeed public, the state as a landowner has an important part to play in all of that too, in terms of how we mix that together. So we get the kind of provision that allows for affordability of housing that allows people like Al and others to come and settle and actually make a life in our communities, to make sure that our communities are repopulated and sustain their populations and actually vibrant, thriving, ongoing communities in that sense. Thanks.
Excellent, Callum, many thanks for that, and it's a really good point. I don't think we should forget that the state is, of course, a large landowner in a number of different ways here in Caithness and Sutherland. But that kind of leads very nicely on, and I'll ask Rhoda again, kind of a two-part question here. It's just maybe whether she wants to expand a little bit on trying to get some of this legislation through Parliament and discussing some of these issues, because I know that you've been a great friend to Community Land Scotland and our aspirations. But here in Caithness in particular, we also have some issues around some of the main areas of depopulation being in our bigger towns, and how looking to repopulate or looking at to stem depopulation, there may be a contradiction between bigger towns and rural areas, and how we should focus on those, and whether there is a contradiction there indeed. Again, that's quite a lot of a question for you, Rhoda. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, I suppose taking the first one first is getting it through the Scottish Parliament. I think there is goodwill there to try and make a difference. I think the trouble is when there are obviously vested interests in this, and you know, if you own a big chunk of Scotland, you're not going to be awfully keen to give that away, because with, you know, land as an economic driver, it gives power, and all of those things are things that people want to hang on to. And the moment you start trying to take that off them, that they're not very happy about it. And I think it is that public interest thing to turn that on its head, because, you know, I suppose one of the things that's alarming me at the moment is there are private landowners who are quite benevolent, you know, and I'm watching communities almost be drawn into this benevolence, and they're using it, you know, it's a bit like a cash cow, it's a bit like all those things that people think are good. But I'm noticing that those benevolent landowners will kind of deliver for the community what they're looking for, but they won't give it to them, you know, so they're still holding those reins. And then when there is an issue with that community and that landowner, you know where the power balance is going to lie in all of that. And the more that becomes part of the essential services, the more beholden the community is to that landowner, and then forced almost to accept what they're doing. So we have to be very careful about, and to me it's the power dynamic, it's who wields, who has the lever of power in all of this. So in a way, crofting is not ownership, but crofting gives the crofter the levers of power, so that it becomes a different dynamic. So we have to be very careful, and those are the dynamics that will, you know, and in the Parliament, I know will be voiced, and will be voiced loudly when some of this comes on. But we have to make sure that this works for the public interest. Otherwise, these communities are going to die. Let's be very, very clear that communities are on their knees. You talked about kind of the small urban versus the rural, and possibly versus the big urban as well. You know, I live in Inverness. I see houses going up on a scale, and in fact, other than potholes, it was a second thing that was really striking me as I was speaking to voters over the election, that people were saying all these houses are going up. Where are the people coming from? And where are the services, the schools, the pubs, the churches, the doctors' practices to serve all those people? So there is this very pool, a big pool in the urban areas, and a lot of that is to do with jobs, access to services. So it's about, and we've seen that more with centralisation, when services are withdrawn from communities that people follow. So people need to stay in a community, they need a job, they need a home, and they need access to services. And if we can't give them that, and there's no amount of persuasion that's going to put that right. And I suppose some of the things, you know, government policy is about repopulation, stopping depopulation, but then we see centralisation. I mean, one of the big issues that affects WIC as well is air traffic control and the centralisation to Inverness, which is creaking at the, at the seams with people, and yet those jobs and those people are going to be drawn into the centre, where the impact they can have on Wick, on Kirkwall and all those places is huge. So we have to really think about what we're doing, how we get the jobs out. I suppose the one thing that COVID has taught us is most people can work anywhere. And there is no reason for people to have to live in cities to get work. We can get that work out to them now. And if we start doing that and provide people with that and affordable housing, because, we hear over and over and over again, people being priced out. But at the same time, if you put some of those well-paid jobs into the rural areas, people can then compete with people in well-paid jobs from out west. So it's all linked together. I'm sorry, I could go on forever because it is interlinked, and we need to do something about recognising that and putting the policies in place.
No, don't worry, there was a lot of nodding heads around the table there, so I think there's a lot of agreement. One of the points that you raised kind of struck me as something that's quite close to my heart, and I hear a lot here in Caithness, and it's around this larger settlements and population growth and larger settlements kind of masking the decrease in population elsewhere. So I'm going to actually address this question to Ian, and it came up in the chat, and around how we make sure that these new repopulation zones don't just mask depopulation elsewhere in our region.
Yeah, good question, and I was trying to reply to it live on the chat, but needless to say, I couldn't figure out how to do it. So here we are. Yeah, the paper that I was talking about, the population paper, the repopulation paper, goes into a bit more detail about that. But the really striking thing is that it very clearly, one of the first things it says, that it has to be place-based. In other words, it's not just a Caithness and Sutherland one-size-fits-all any more than it's a one-size-fits-all for any of the other local authority areas that are part of the pilot project. It has to be based on which areas in particular are suffering and why, and what can we do. And there is some detail in the paper as well about the kinds of measures, the kinds of tools that might be appropriate to use. And it does include housing as one of the issues, and how we might intervene in that as well. We being effectively the public sector. Does that answer it, Magnus?
I think it does. It's a good answer there, and it was concise, which was more important to me. There was an interesting perspective there, and it was around place-based approaches. And I think one of what we see here in Caithness and North Sutherland, particularly, is this place-based approach to the economic challenge of the wind down of Dounreay is incredibly important. So I'll address this one towards Peter and ask, what role do government partnerships and broader policy frameworks play in these initiatives being addressing depopulation?
Okay, thanks, Magnus. Well, we have a Scottish Government representative that sits on the executive board, and we find that that's extremely useful in gaining access to policy discussions about the things that we're trying to progress. So there are often policy issues around any development of any size. For example, the step reactor we talked about, there are policies issues that potentially around that. So we find that active engagement of government in that sense has been very useful. Our approach to depopulation, if you like, as CNSRP, we're kind of fairly singularly focused on seeking to attract employment and making sure that we're not inadvertently blocking ways of employing people in more remote and rural places, because policies are being set for a Scotland-wide situation, which often means that they don't always take account of how that might impact in more rural areas. So making sure that we have good access to our sort of political masters, as it were, is really important. So I don't know if that helped to answer the question.
Yeah, no, really useful content. Thanks, Peter. I think it was Peter's microphone there that was had a wee bit of reverb. But Ian's got his hand up, and I know that you're hugely experienced in this area as well, Ian. So I'd ask you to come back in.
No, all I was going to say was that one of the issues behind that, I think, is we've seen a lot of very positive progress over the last few years in terms of island proofing. A lot of policies. There have been tentative moves to remote rural proof, and I see that as a step forward if we can make it in this next session of Parliament. Because I think some of the issues we're talking about now, and some of the potential, and even the stuff that we've been talking about, these repopulation areas, are effectively an attempt to remote rural proof the issues that we're seeing addressed quite effectively in an island context.
Thanks, Ian. I think Callum has alluded in the past of what I think is a very nice phrase, and it's a rural New Deal. So I'll maybe ask him to expand after I go to Ronnie, because I've got an excellent question on housing that's come up a number of times in the comments. And it's largely looking at when we're talking about housing in the region, a lot of comments or a lot of discussions around housing for young people. But there's been a number of comments here about older returners wanting to come back to the region and making sure policy doesn't exclude older people by just focusing on younger people. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Ronnie.
Yeah, Magnus, I mean, a lot of our work, unfortunately, couldn't show all the projects we're working on, but an interesting one, especially just now, was with Salma Rostig in Skye, the Gaelic College, and that's providing a range of housing tenures and opportunities for elderly. And most of our projects touch on that and include that, like I said in the presentation, holistic approaches is really important. So yeah, you know, elderly, key workers, young families, each community is unique. And touching on what Ian and Peter were saying there, you know, the place-based approach is extremely important. And I think from our experience and our work over the last few years, it's clear that communities can influence policy and do the policy rather than have the policy done to them, if you like. I think that's important for communities to keep in mind. They've got a really strong positive platform at the moment to influence policy going forward.
Excellent, thank you for that, Ronnie. Yeah, Callum, I just wondered if you wanted to give a couple of thoughts on the rural New Deal approach to some of the discussion that we've been having here.
Yeah, thanks, Magnus. I mean, that idea was something I kind of outlined in, and apologies in advance to folks that are watching this webinar. I don't know how far in the geographic direction the West Highland Free Press's readership extends, but it was kind of outlined there, broadly speaking. So I suppose it's really about, when I was writing about that, I was really about placing land at the centre of that process, certainly, and all the kind of things that can be unlocked through that. That's very much the case. And Ian mentioned the kind of island proofing stuff that's been going on, and that's been very welcome as well, and broadening that out in terms of the mainland is important too with regard to that. But there's also something here as well around, and this is pretty obvious to see, to reiterate what Rhoda mentioned around connecting all these dimensions up. There are lots and lots of different strands here that need to be connected up. And to give just one example of that, which touches on something that was said already, it's digital connectivity, clearly. So we all know that digital connectivity is so important in terms of getting job opportunities into rural areas and islands and elsewhere as well. But one of the challenges there is, and I think it may have been mentioned already, is that you can also have digital connectivity drawing jobs out, and we absolutely need to be mindful of that too. So the idea that if you can, you know, run your air traffic control systems or other types of dimensions as easily from Edinburgh or elsewhere, as opposed to in the communities themselves, where they're really important elements of that, I think is something that needs to be borne in mind as well. So making sure that digital divide is crossed and closed rather is a really fundamentally important aspect of that. So we do need, you know, we live in difficult, challenging times with regard to the public finances, but we do need to make the kind of investments that are going to actually secure the futures of communities in rural areas, not least in Caithness and Sutherland, to enable exactly that sort of New Deal approach to secure well-being sustainably in that sense. So land is at the centre of that. There's a whole lot of other connections as well, I think.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off one second last question directed at Rhoda, but then I'll ask others if they have any thoughts to come in, and then I'll go round and I'll ask everybody to sum up with kind of one point towards the end on another question. But Rhoda, one of the things that comes back time and time again, and is very much actually the bread and butter of my day work with UHI, is around land use policy. But what I'm interested here in Caithness and Sutherland is how we can use land use policy, perhaps post-Brexit, to help stop depopulation here in Caithness and Sutherland, not just potentially post-Brexit, but looking at net zero and around ecological impact too.
I think there are opportunities, but I think there are also challenges, and I think we've seen you know, the green landlords becoming an issue because kind of carbon sinks and carbon sequestration is going to be a huge deal, and people are going to, it's going to become very lucrative because people need to offset the carbon that they're creating. So I think and again, it is making sure that those levers are in the hands of the community and not in the hands of folk that are going to make a huge amount of profit. And I mean, Caithness, peatlands, low country, you know, all of that I think is really important. We need to look at things like planting trees as well for communities, but it's a case of the right tree in the right place. So you have to be careful where you put that down. We need to look at how we actually use, I suppose, become more sustainable. And this is another issue, you know, when we're talking about the staffing and where to build the houses. You know, the trouble is with planning these days, they say build the houses in the in-by land, you know, in the good land. No, we don't. We have to manage that. And we also have to remember that grass is a better carbon sink than forestry. So it's about grass-fed animals and raising them and making sure that it's well understood and well labelled that this is actually sustainable farming. And there's a whole issue about fishing as well, about, you know, when you're talking about harbour towns, about how we add value to all of that rather than just stick it in a lorry and send it to the continent. How do we actually create the jobs and keep the wealth? So all of that is tied up with who owns the land and who owns that economic lever, and that is a huge economic lever. And somebody put in the chat about Gail's rural proofing bill, and I think it was really interesting. I suppose my one concern is I haven't really seen anything tangible come out of the island proofing bill. So having a bill without teeth is useless. It gives people a false sense of security. And every time I've seen an island impact assessment being used and just as a tick box exercise and makes not the slightest bit of good, we need to revisit it. I'm not saying the principle's not good, but we need to revisit it in a way that works. Just another box to tick is of no use to anybody.
I think that's a really fantastic point towards the end. We need to make sure this there's something, there's meat in the bones of the legislation to make sure it works properly. I'm conscious that I said I would open that question up to others. Has anybody got any strong feelings on land use policy and depopulation in Caithness and Sutherland? Ronnie, on you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's referring back to maybe some things that were highlighted earlier, I think by yourself, Rhoda, about what you're hearing in the likes of Inverness, where they're asking about, you know, where all these people are going to go and what they're going to do with it, where's the service is going to come from. It's almost the converse in the rural areas. It's an opportunity. Hugh's development in staffing is actually dealing with this sustainably. So he's providing a health centre there that means folks in the area don't need to travel to Inverness, and you know, they can deal with all these services locally. Makes the community more sustainable, makes it easier for the elderly to stay in the community, and there's lots of opportunities like that in rural communities. Like I said earlier, I think it's important that communities drive policy on that.
Excellent, thanks, Ronnie. Again, I'm just conscious of time and thanking everybody for giving up their Wednesday evening. To save the embarrassment of going around and everybody saying community land ownership is the saviour to our depopulation issues in Caithness and Sutherland, I'm going to ask our panellists here what they find might be one of the most interesting solutions or remedies to some of the depopulation issues we've got here. So it can be large, it can be small, it can be niche, it can be very wide ranging. So something interesting, and I'll maybe go and pick on Callum first of all.
Thanks very much for that, Magnus. This is a general point around, I think it was raised already, we've had a focus, rightly so, in terms of young people and making sure that there's affordable housing and other opportunities for young people in our communities, because we know there's a demographic issue going on there in terms of the overall dynamics of all that. But there's a really important part for other, and I speak as an older member of the community as well, I think now, there's an important aspect in terms of older folk as well, and drawing on their expertise and encouraging people to come back as well in relation to that. And somebody mentioned in one of the questions earlier on, we didn't get to it, but different groups with regard to that. There are some interesting examples in Scandinavia, I think, of how drawing on the older demographic in terms of their expertise, their experience and other aspects as well when they come into communities has been a really important part of that building of capacity and social and community cohesion. So I think that's well worth bearing in mind as well. This is an inclusive process.
I think that's a really good comment as well, and captures one of the questions that we didn't quite get a chance to touch on today. I'm just going to pick on people because I'm quite enjoying my position of power this evening, so I'll shift over to Ronnie next because he's next on the screen.
Thanks, Magnus. Well, I suppose, as we said in our presentation, you know, taking the holistic and sustainable approach, communities, I feel, can inform their own development, and I'm talking wider community development, but that works especially well with affordable housing and a range of options that are there. So a lot of the tools are there. We'd like to help get that moving.
Excellent, thank you. I am also conscious, despite the time, that Al very much gave up his seat to invite others into this panel discussion. So I'll ask him at the end if he wants to contribute just a very short, innovative idea as well. But I'll move on to Peter next.
Yes, thanks, Magnus. Okay, I think one thing that I think would be really valuable is for everybody to recognise, government, etc., to recognise that urbanisation is kind of a natural pressure, so that there is almost a natural pressure. I think I read a statistic that said that 75% of the world's population by 2050 will live in cities. And so there's a natural draw for cities, and so there's always a pressure for more rural areas to have to overcome. And so I think an overt recognition of that by everybody, that it needs positive discrimination to try and help more rural communities to attract the jobs, to attract the young people to come and live there. So just that.
That is an excellent answer when you had a fusion reactor up your other sleeve. I'll move on and ask Rhoda next, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's kind of, I suppose it follows neatly on from what Peter was saying. The reason that cities flourish is that the decision makers live in cities, they understand cities and they make policy for cities. So unless we get the decision makers living in rural areas making policy for rural areas, we will never change that direction. And I think we, instead of rural proofing, which means that somebody in a city is doing it to you, I think we need to have rurally designed policy, designed in rural areas. And every policy you see designed in a rural area, near me, for example, works in an urban area, works very well in an urban area. The opposite is not true. So let's just, rather than rural proof, just make policy in rural areas, and they can city proof it if they want.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant way of putting it, and city proofing might be my next go-to one. Ian, I'll ask you if you can contribute here too.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up directly on what Rhoda said, because it's kind of a version of what I was going to say. And it's really boring, but for me, it's connectivity, and it's digital connectivity. I think several people tonight have spoken about the sense of leveling up that has come over the last 12 months, where everything we thought was impossible digitally 12 months ago, we've kind of proved isn't that impossible, including, as Rhoda said, the Near Me, NHS Near Me, which started in this rural area and is now, well, it's not universal, but it's very, very widespread. That's an example of something that was designed out of necessity to help mitigate a major issue, which was about access to services. And I think digital is one really, really substantial way of delivering that very quickly.
I think that's an excellent point. We shouldn't forget the precursor to the NHS that was formed here in the Highlands off the back of that too. I'm not sure if Al's still with us, but I'll open it up just to ask if Al's got any contribution here, and to say thanks again for contributing tonight.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great to be involved. I'm still here. So yeah, I'm going to go back to crofting again, but my dream, I guess, would be to see crofting opened up in the Highlands. I think it's quite narrow at the moment. It's become very narrow with sheep and cattle, and that's the main things that are supported. So and woodland to an extent, but it's still not quite there. So a kind of dream I'd like to see is these new crofting townships, small groups of small crofts where people are living and actually living sustainably off the land and producing food for local areas. So if you want to come here and you want to grow food on your land, on a small croft, you should be supported for that. Whether it's growing vegetables, whether it's growing, can be sheep and cattle, it can be pigs, it can be mushrooms, it could be anything that supports the local community. And I think we have a duty to support, if we're going to support crofting and agriculture nationally after Brexit, then I think we need to support everyone, and we need to support people that are producing food locally, regardless of what that is. So it's a local thing rather than a directly on sheep and cattle and specific. So that would be something I'd love to see.
That's an excellent answer, and probably one that would mirror the answer I would give if I had been asked myself. And I would also say working in some of the sustainable industries that Peter and Ian had mentioned around hydrogen and tidal and offshore wind and such like. But I am conscious I've ran well over the time with this. I was not ruthless enough. But I'll hand back to Ailsa to finish off and round up. But thank you very much to all our panellists and contributors tonight, and particularly those that were asking the question.
Brilliant, Magnus. Thank you. I think 5 minutes is not bad, given the range of subjects we've been covering tonight, which has been really fascinating. So again, thank you to all the presenters and the panelists. And I've just come away with sort of 2 or 3. Rhoda made some really strong points about who owns the land being a major economic lever, and where the power dynamic lies in rural communities. And I think that what Ronnie and Hugh have told us is about the power dynamic can lie with communities, and they can design their own future, and there are a lot of tools there to enable them to do that, but we all need more support. And I think Callum's point about public interest has got to be at the heart of all public investment decisions, no matter where that investment is landing, whether it's communities or the private sector or the public sector. Public interest must be at the heart of that. And Ian's details about repopulation zones, I think we'll all be really looking forward to the details of how they're going to work. work. I'm sure they're going to have a lot to add to this agenda. So thank you again to everybody who's joined us tonight. A really fantastic turnout. Our next session is on Wednesday, the 9th of June at 2 p.m. So an afternoon session next time, and it's on community regeneration and resilience. So we'll probably pick up some of the issues tonight, but that's much more about wider activities of communities. And I think how communities were able to contribute to the response in COVID will be a really interesting discussion there, and how a lot of the sort of structures that were set up can be maintained to take those communities in the future. So thank you again, everyone, for bearing with us, for running over, and we'll hopefully see you all on the 9th of June. Thank you. Bye.